Hello, everyone, and welcome. This is Falon Morgan from the New Student Orientation Team. This session is a panel on racial justice and confronting racism and is coordinated by the Office of the Provost. Please note that this session will be recorded. Closed captioning is available by clicking on the closed captioning icon in Zoom. We recognize that this program may address sensitive topics that could be difficult for some students based on personal experiences with this content. Please note that if you need to leave at any point for self-care, you are welcome to do so. There is also a licensed clinician available today for students who may need additional professional support. The licensed clinician is available today from 4 to 5:30 p.m. Eastern Time and can be reached by clicking the clinician link found on the Canvas page for the Racial Justice Panel event. I would like to introduce the moderator for this event, Rosemary Kilkenny, Vice President for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at Georgetown University, who will begin this program.
Good afternoon and welcome to you all. Although we are excited and happy to welcome you, the class of 2024, to the Hilltop this fall, this moment feels even more momentous. This year will look and feel different than in years past. It will require us to come together as a community and to meet our challenges with imagination, compassion, and determination. You are joining this community, this family, at a remarkably challenging time. But if the past is any indication, then I have every confidence that this year will lead us to be more creative, inspire us to be more selfless, and in many ways bring us closer together than ever before. The need for us to rally around each other is even more urgent than before. Like many of you, I woke up this morning and was stung yet again by the tragic news that another Black man was gunned down by police in Kenosha, Wisconsin. His name is Jacob Blake. As we fully well know for sure, Mr. Blake is not the first Black man or person to have been shot or injured or mercilessly killed at the hands of individuals in law enforcement in that state or in this country for that matter. I am deeply disturbed by the video depicting the event, and as if this was not enough, Mr. Blake was shot multiple times in his back while his 3 children were in his car looking on. There have been multiple calls for investigation of that incident, but it cannot just stop there. We have to look at all of our institutions. We have to look at our schools, our colleges, our workplaces, to name a few, to transform them and seriously dismantle the long-standing vestiges of discrimination that result in benefits for some and disadvantages and exclusion for others. At our workshop today on racial justice confronting racism, you will hear from 3 leaders who have worked on these issues for many, many years from their vantage points. You will first hear from President John DeGioia, who I now have the pleasure of introducing to you. President DeGioia is Georgetown's 48th president and the first lay person to lead this great institution. I have had the pleasure of working with President DeGioia for over 3 decades, and we have witnessed and participated in significant growth and development of our university. Under his leadership, President DeGioia has catapulted Georgetown from a major national university to a global university with academic and exchange programs on almost every continent of this world. President DeGioia has not only deepened Georgetown's tradition of academic excellence, its commitment to its Catholic and Jesuit identity, its engagement with the Washington, D.C. community, and its global mission, he has also been a leader in shaping the future landscape of higher education, as evidenced by his service and leadership in a variety of major national organizations. And I will name a few, such as the American Council on Education, the Forum for the Future of Higher Education, the Carnegie Corporation of New York, the National Association of Independent Schools, to name a few. President DeGioia also serves on the NCAA Board of Governors. For those of you who don't know, that's started from the National Collegiate Athletic Association. He's also the chair of the Division I Committee on Academics of the NCAA and he has previously served as a commissioner of the Knight Commission on Intercollegiate Athletics. Before his rise to the presidency of Georgetown in July 2001, Dr. DeGioia served as Dean of Students, Vice President of Administration, and Senior Vice President. Dr. DeGioia also teaches in the philosophy department, where he teaches an Ignatian seminar each fall. He is truly a Hoya, having earned his undergraduate and doctoral degrees from Georgetown. In recognition of his leadership in a variety of areas that I've already mentioned, he has also received several honorary degrees from colleges and universities in the United States as well as overseas. Some of them include Miami-Dade College, Loyola University in Maryland, Queen's University in Belfast, and Seattle University, to name a few. Without any further ado, let me now ask President DeGioia to make opening remarks and reflect on this important topic that we are discussing today. President DeGioia?
Thank you very much, Rosemary. Thank you. It's very kind of you. It is a privilege to join you all for this gathering. I want to thank you and my colleagues for their leadership in enabling us all to come together in this way. Good afternoon, everyone. What a meaningful time to be with all of you, our incoming class, as you embark on your first days as members of our community. Our colleagues have organized an important conversation this afternoon, and I wish to thank the planning team and our student orientation leaders for all of their efforts in support of this convening. As Rosemary shared, we begin with another difficult reminder of the urgency of this conversation about racism in our country. And these most recent acts of police violence in Wisconsin and in Louisiana against Jacob Blake and Trayford Pellerin, both shot by police officers. We bear witness to a system that has too often failed to protect our people. We demand more of ourselves. We expect more of our country. A better future, a better present is possible. In this moment of sadness and pain, it is imperative that we support one another and our Black students and colleagues for whom this moment is especially challenging. I hope you will see in our gathering this afternoon that we are a community united in this work together. Yesterday, we formally welcomed you into our academic community at our new student convocation, and there you heard about what it means for you to join a university community, the values and experiences that you will share as members of this community. We reflected on the mission of universities, our enduring commitment to formation, inquiry, and to the common good. As we gather today, we can see these three elements of who we are come alive as we seek to understand the responsibilities that we as individuals and as an institution have in the promotion of racial justice. 155 years ago, the 13th Amendment was passed, abolishing slavery in the United States. Yet our society is still grappling with the problems of racism and racial injustice against people of African descent. We see the structural manifestations of this and the need to address persistent gaps in income, housing, education, and health disparities, police violence, unemployment rates, mass incarceration and unjust sentencing practices, environmental discrimination. And we see it in our daily lives, in words and actions that reflect racist attitudes. What we witness and experience must lead us to confront issues of racial injustice. The university can be an invaluable resource to us in this work. We engage in the work of formation. We are engaged in work to understand our own interiority, our beliefs and attitudes, our biases and prejudices, our ways of interpreting and making meaning in our world. We must ask ourselves, how might we, perhaps unconsciously or unintentionally, be contributing to or perpetuating these legacies of injustice? For our Black students, our students of color, when you experience racism and discrimination in your daily lives, these are external blocks to your own flourishing that we must confront with you as you seek to achieve all that you are capable of. All of us are engaged in this work of personal formation, of securing that sense of authenticity that we are who each of us is called to be, that we are what each of us are meant to be. We engage in the work of inquiry. We know that historically the very ideas of race and subsequently of racism are social constructs, the product of early colonial American scholarship developed and nurtured in order to justify the institution of slavery. But as you heard yesterday, our role in society is to pursue the truth. And we must endeavor to uncover and expose those constructs in our world which do not recognize the inherent dignity of each person. We must be unrelenting in this pursuit. And we advance the common good. We seek to make a difference in our communities and uphold our shared responsibilities for our civic life together. This is work that you will come to know. This is work that you will have an opportunity to contribute to through your scholarship, your service, your engagement during your time at Georgetown. We've been engaged in a number of projects as a response to this call for racial justice in our nation. From the efforts of our Health Justice Alliance and our Health Disparities Initiatives, programs in community-based policing, reform, and transformation, initiatives on technology and society, work in the humanities, on African American history and culture, on equity in education, public policy, and environmental justice, and our Prison and Justice Initiative, which seeks to uplift the dignity of people incarcerated and to end the injustices in the prison system. Each of these activities and more help to animate our understanding that a commitment to the common good is inextricable from our understanding of our history as a nation and the urgent work to ensure that our communities support the flourishing of all of our people. You will engage in this work here at Georgetown, guided by extraordinary faculty who bring unparalleled wisdom and knowledge regarding how to address and respond to racial justice. And today you'll hear from 3 individuals who have made a disproportionate difference in their areas of work. Rosemary Kilkenny, who opened our session, who for 40 years has helped to shape our efforts on diversity and inclusion here at Georgetown. And Dr. Angeline Mitchell, a foremost scholar of Toni Morrison and founder of our African American Studies at Georgetown. And Father Brian Massingale, who we have been privileged to welcome on a number of occasions to share his reflections and insights on justice in the context of our mission as a Catholic institution. 3 years ago, we convened a special gathering here at Georgetown as part of our work on slavery, memory, and reconciliation. You'll have an opportunity to learn more about this initiative and our university's history tomorrow in some of your afternoon sessions, and then throughout your time here at Georgetown. In 2017, we gathered with our community and with members of the descendant community, families whose ancestors had been enslaved on Jesuit plantations in Maryland, to express our contrition and to apologize for our university's role in the history of slavery and the enslavement of people. And it was Father Brian Massingale's words that I recited as I offered our apology. These were Father Massingale's words, and I quote, "Justice is a pathos, a desire, a longing, a yearning, indeed a passion, before it is a concept or a definition." Close quote. As you engage in this conversation today, guided by these three extraordinary leaders, I hope that you will find inspiration for your own journey towards justice, for your work to combat racism, and for your commitment to advancing the common good. Thank you. Thank you for this opportunity to share these reflections with you. I wish you all the very, very best.
Thank you, President DeGioia, for those powerful words and reflections on this significant issue that's facing our nation. As you have said, we have to work together. It's imperative that we do, because if we continue on this path, there's no good end in sight. And so what I would like to do now is to make some very quick introductions of Dr. Mitchell, as well as of Dr. Reverend Massingale. So let me begin with Dr. Mitchell. As President DeGioia noted, Dr. Mitchell has been a long-serving faculty member in our Department of English, and she founded the African American Studies program here at Georgetown. Her teaching and research interests are in African American literature and cultural studies, African American studies, race and representation, race and politics, African American music, African American history, slavery in the United States, in this American South, and contemporary Black women writers. She has been the recipient of the Georgetown College's Dean's Award for Excellence in Teaching. In 2017, Dr. Mitchell was named Diverse Issues in Higher Education, one of 25 outstanding women leaders in higher education, making a difference in the world by tackling some of higher education's toughest challenges and exhibiting extraordinary leadership skills. Dr. Mitchell is an expert on the works of Nobel laureate Toni Morrison. And for those of you who have done your homework, we provided you with a clip of an interview that Toni Morrison had with one of our foremost journalists, Charlie Rose. And I hope you had an opportunity to listen to that clip. In any event, I'm going to just pivot a little bit and speak about some of the work that Dr. Mitchell has published. She has edited Within the Circle, an anthology of African American literary criticism from the Harlem Renaissance to the present, which is the first anthology of 20th century African American literature and cultural criticism and 20th century African American intellectual history. She is the author of The Freedom to Remember, Narrative Slavery and Gender in the Contemporary Black Women Fiction. She is the co-editor of the Cambridge Companion to African American Women's Writing and has also done countless other works around the work of Toni Morrison. Her next book is titled 3 Transformative Years, a Racial Biography of 1963, 1965, and 1968. As Dr. DeGioia mentioned, She founded the African American Studies program in 2003 and served as its first director. Dr. Mitchell is a member of several professional organizations, including the College Language Association and the Toni Morrison Society. Let me also now quickly introduce Dr. Massengale. Reverend Brian Massengale is a James and Nancy Buckman Professor of Theological and Social Ethics, as well as the Senior Ethics Fellow in Fordham's Center for Ethics Education. Prior to his appointment at Fordham University, he was Professor of Theology at Marquette University. Professor Massengale is a leader in the field of theological ethics. He's a past convener of the Black Catholic Theological Symposium and the former president of the Catholic Theological Society of America. He's a member of the board of directors of the Society of Christian Ethics and serves on the editorial board of Theological Studies. He has done a substantial amount of work in the area of racism and the African American experience in this country. And I will just give you a few examples of the work that he has written. One of your assignments was for you to read one of his latest essays, which is titled "The Assumptions of White Privilege and What We Can Do About It." I'm sure that all of you have read that work. In addition to that work, he has written a book called Beyond Authenticity, Black and Truly Catholic. He's also written White Supremacy, the Election of Donald Trump, and The Challenge to Theology. Another work that he's written is Beyond Who I Am to Judge. At this moment, I'm going to pause, given the limited time that we have left, and I'll ask Dr. Mitchell to say a few words and offer reflections on this topic. And then I will turn to Reverend Massengale to do the same. And then you will have questions that you will entertain from the audience, as well as a few opening questions that I will pose to our panelists. Dr. Mitchell, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Vice President Kilkenny, for that warm introduction. And good afternoon to all. I am delighted to be with you, and I thank very much all involved in our Fall 2020 NSO. Welcome to our new students. I'd also like to take a moment to send healing thoughts to Jacob Blake and his family. We pray he survives, and we also still seek justice for Breonna Taylor. I'd like to contextualize just for a moment much of what Vice President Kilkenny mentioned about my work at Georgetown. My research, my teaching, and my institutional work here has been animated in large part by our panel's topic, Confronting Racism. And it's been my good fortune to do this work here at Georgetown, an institution, as you read in its mission statement, quote, founded on the principle that serious and sustained discourse among people of different faiths, cultures, and beliefs promotes intellectual, ethical, and spiritual understanding, end quote. My first book is an anthology of African-American literary criticism, and it's also a volume of African-American intellectual history, a history situated around African-American thought on race and culture. My second book is centered on representations of slavery in contemporary Black women's fiction and how those representations speak to larger concerns and contemporary audiences about race and gender in the US. And my third book, part of the Cambridge Companion Collection, is a volume that analyzes African-American women's literature while also presenting African-American women's intellectual history. So centering African-American cultural productions and intellectual thought in all of my work has been one of the ways, I think, that I have confronted racism through my scholarly work. In my courses, including Slavery and the American Literary Imagination, Reading Race in American Culture, African-American Cultural Studies, Introduction to African-American Introduction to African-American Studies, Ta-Nehisi Coates, writer-activist, and Reading Toni Morrison, I also confront racism because it's essential to do so when teaching about race and its significances in American culture. I'm a firm believer, as was Frederick Douglass in the 19th century, that education is a democratizing and empowering tool. And in that spirit, I founded and directed the African American Studies program from 2003 to 2013, which became the Department of African American Studies in 2016. Institutionalizing the study of African American culture, life, and experiences in our curriculum, I think, is a very powerful way, not only to confront racism, but also to build community and to advance the goals stated in our mission statement.
Thank you, Dr. Michelle. Reverend Massengale, it's your turn.
Great. Thank you for this invitation, and thank you to the class of 2024 for this opportunity to be a part of your orientation to college life. It's a joy to be with you, even though we're by a distance. I look forward to coming back to Georgetown to visit again when one day we get this pandemic under control. Confronting racism is hard work. If it wasn't hard work, we wouldn't need to have this kind of panel. And what makes it hard is that there's no way to have an honest, effective, meaningful conversation about race without people becoming uncomfortable. So, if you feel uncomfortable during this time, I want to say that's good and necessary, because part of the reason why race continues to be this ever-present plague in American life is because we've been unwilling, many of us, to be uncomfortable, to speak uncomfortable truths or to listen to uncomfortable truths that could be very unsettling. One of those unfortunate truths that we've just referred to several times already is the most recent event of police violence against an African-American, Jacob Black, in Kenosha, Wisconsin. And I want to speak to that because Wisconsin is my home. I grew up in Milwaukee. I taught at Marquette University. Kenosha is part of the Milwaukee Archdiocese, of which I'm a priest. But we also know that Kenosha, Wisconsin could be Washington, D.C. It could be New Orleans, Louisiana. It could be New York. It could be Los Angeles, California. It could be Denver, Colorado. What we're dealing with here is not a series of isolated incidents. What we're dealing with here talks about the shape of our society and who we are as a nation. When you're entering into college right now as a class of 2024, I'm sure you have many different dreams. And one of the things what question I want to put forward to you is, what do you want your nation to look like in 2024? What's your dream for this country in 2024? Because if we're going to have a better society, a better nation in 2024, then we as a country and you as students have to have the courage to ask deep questions. Questions such as, why? Why is it that the COVID pandemic, while all of us are vulnerable to it, we're not equally vulnerable? Why is it that Black and Latino and indigenous communities have been suffering the effects of this pandemic vastly disproportionate to their numbers in our population? Why is it that Asian Americans feel frightened to leave their homes or even to come to school or walk on campus because they're stigmatized with being the bearers of this disease? Why? Why is it that certain of us fear the police and have to have lessons from our parents on how to behave ourselves or how to conduct ourselves when we're stopped by police officers, and yet others, and let's be honest here, many whites, have never had that conversation? Speaking personally, why is it that when I got my driver's license at the age of 16, my parents didn't say, congratulations, now you can chauffeur your brothers and sisters around. The first thing they did was to sit me down and explain that when you're stopped by the police, you keep your hand on the steering wheel at 10 o'clock and 2 o'clock, You say, yes, sir, no, sir, and you don't do anything until they give you permission to do so. Why? And we have to have the courage to question and challenge the answers that are too often given. Namely, that Blacks and Latinos are absent in our public spaces, that they're in our institutions of imprisonment and incarceration because basically they're too dumb and lazy and violent to succeed.
Mm-hmm.
And when we strip away all the fancy words and intellectual theorizing, and Dr. Mitchell, I wish I were a student at Georgetown because I would take every one of your classes. They sound fantastic. I mean, I teach a course on Martin, Malcolm, Barwin, and the church. You're beat me, so I'm really. But we have to strip away all the intellectual theorizing. When we strip it all away, it comes down to the fact we believe that certain groups deserve to be in a lesser place, and that white people deserve to belong in places of advantage and privilege because some are deemed lazy, dumb, and violent, and others are given the presumption of competence, the presumption of being worthy to belong. So the conversation we're having today, the reason why I'm involved in it, is because as a priest, as a Catholic, I believe that our souls are at stake. There are many ways to understand racism. Racism can be understood as a social exclusion, as a political issue. And at its deepest core, racism raises profound questions of who we are and whether we're being malformed, deformed, warped by our society to believe that certain groups deserve to be excluded, whereas others are given the presumption of extravagant welcome. So our conversation this afternoon is just the beginning of a conversation that needs to happen throughout your years at Georgetown. Because unless we have the courage to ask uncomfortable questions and to live with answers to those questions that may unsettle us, then you're going to graduate in 2024 and wonder why the world still feels like 2020. So with that, then let's begin our conversation, because I do think this is vitally important, and not just for Georgetown or Fordham or Marquette or any other institutions. This is important for the kind of world that we're going to try to create and need to create if we're going to live together.
Thank you very much for words, Father Massengale. You have put out a very strong challenge to our students, and that is for you as students to use these 4 years and take the opportunity to learn as much as you can and to do your part to contribute to dismantling of some of these barriers that persist within our institution. Make sure that you reach out to other students and your classmates who are different from yourselves. Make sure that you set a certain example when you're in the class to nurture an atmosphere where your classmates sitting next to you who may be different from you feels a sense of belonging. We often talk about the term racism, and there's some concepts like racism, white supremacy, white privilege that we often use. I would like to begin by asking Dr. Mitchell and Father Massengale to talk a little bit, what do you mean when you hear the term racism? Let's try to have a working definition so that we kind of all operating with the same concept in mind and the meaning of that concept. Dr. Mitchell?
Yes, I'm going to come at that a different way, I think. Instead of defining racism, I'd like to foreground anti-racism. And I want to do that because I believe that we do know what racism is. I have been very, very interested in the discussions that we've had that in some ways seem disingenuous to me, as if we are in the year 2020, suddenly learning about racism, because I just don't think that's our lived experience. I don't think that's the history of this country. I think anytime that we are in spaces that don't look like the United States, we need to mark that, note that, and ask, why is that the case? And I'm talking not only about the public spaces that we are in. I'm talking also about the private spaces that we're in. Because racism, its policies, its practices, its institution, and its institutionalizing exists because we allow it to. And so I'd like to think about that. And I'm very invested in the work of Dr. Ibram Kendi.
Oh, yeah.
I think his book is absolutely fabulous. How to be anti-racist. In other words, not to become, how to be, because it's an active choice, right? Because so much in our society, as we know, has been founded upon, predicated upon notions of racial disparities, inequities, right? And on racism. And so I think that's one of the reasons why Father Massengel's article on the Amy Cooper, Christian Cooper incident is so useful, especially his 20-point list of the enactment and interpretation, I think, of race, right? Because it reminded me very much of Peggy McIntosh's essay from the late 80s, I think, 1988, White Privilege, Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack. And I've always wondered to whom this knapsack was truly invisible. Which goes back to my point. I think we know racism. What we don't know is how to be anti-racist. And it does take great, great courage. It takes great courage to speak, right? In those moments when we are compelled to. If we didn't know racism, Amy Cooper's actions would not be intelligible to us, but they were. Especially in the long succession of similar actions that have spawned memes, right? And even the tagline, Karen, right? And so that's one of the examples for me that perhaps we need to push that conversation a little bit more.
If I could pick up on that wonderful point you talk about courage. As an ethicist, courage is that virtue that translates convictions into action. In other words, many people have good convictions. We know what the right thing to do is. What we're lacking is the courage to act upon those convictions. I often tell my white students that they will see and hear more raw racial injustice and animus than I will. Because when I'm in the room, we all know how to act. We all know how to speak. We all know certain things we don't say. But I challenge my students, especially my white students, I say, what do you do when I'm not in the room? What do you do when your friends tell that off-color joke? What do you do when your family members start speaking racist nonsense? And we all know what it is. As you said, we know what it is. We lack the courage, though. As I said in the article, what this does, it creates safe spaces for racism to brew and to fester. Because all of the disparities we're talking about in terms of incarceration, lack of educational opportunities, healthcare disparities, they all grow out of these individual so-called private spaces where this grows and festers, because what we've done is we've said, white people learn early on that if they act racist in places of other white people, that white people will give them a pass, that they won't be held accountable, that they can get away with it. And so I think sometimes as academics or as intellectuals, we get caught into the game of defining racism, and that has a place, but I think that kind of that lets us off the hook. Because deep down, we know what the right thing is. Like we looked at what happened in Central Park. We all knew what she was doing. She knew what she was doing.
What she was doing.
Now the problem is that no one's ever called it out. And I think what we need to do is we need to have the courage to act upon our convictions. I think that's the thing that's missing, and the critical thing that's needed as long as we're willing to be bystanders, then we keep the status quo in place.
Father Massengel, a couple of questions have come into you from some of the students in our audience. The first question is, how could Catholics make ending racism a focal point in the church's mission? And then along with that, What can the Catholic Church do to get other faith groups to join with it in ending racism?
Okay, let me take those two questions. Let me start with the second one.
Sure.
The terrible truth is that many other Christian groups are further ahead of the Catholic Church when it comes to engaging racism. For example, I just recently gave a presentation to a group of Episcopal parishes, and you look at their statements on racism, they are far beyond anything we have in the Catholic Church. So I think this is one area in which in ecumenical leadership, I think we as Catholics have to do some catching up on. Why do we do that catching up, and how can we make that more of a Catholic focus? As I said in the article, I think the key thing for Catholics is we need to see racism as a life issue. All too often in Catholic circles, we reduce our concern for life to the protection of unborn life in the womb. However, life is far more than just simply unborn life. As Pope Francis said, we cannot call ourselves pro-life and be concerned with the sanctity of every human life as long as we're willing to turn a blind eye to racism. And he said that statement precisely in invoking George Floyd by name and praying for him by name. And a part of the problem for Catholics is that we need to, as I said in the article, to be unconditionally pro-life. And that means that we have to see racism as a life issue, and we need to hold people accountable. Just as Catholics hold politicians accountable for life issues, we need to see racism as a life issue. And if we do that, then it will be reflected in Catholic catechesis and in preaching. I often ask my students, to say, when the last time you've gone to church, and I say, I don't want you to tell me when you've gone to church, but considering all the times you've gone to church, have you ever heard a priest or a minister or a rabbi or imam in your church, your synagogue, or your mosque ever talk about racism as being against the will of God? Almost no hands go up. Almost none. That's telling. It means we've created a separation between people's understanding of their faith and the religious commitment and the responsibility for how they live in society. And so for the church, I think the first thing the church has to do is, one, we have to be honest about our own complicity in this, and that I'm going to learn more about the Georgetown experience and how Georgetown, I think, has been a leader in the Catholic Church in doing this. But I think also we need to see this as a life issue that requires our unconditional commitment.
I would like to make a request. We have a number of requests coming in from our student audiences that they would like for the session to go beyond 5 o'clock. And so if you are willing and are available, I would love to entertain that possibility. Are you available to do that beyond 5?
Angela, I'm flexible, so I can do that.
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
great.
Absolutely.
Yes, I mean, if the students want to have this kind of conversation, I'm like, let's go for it.
Yes.
So wonderful. Dr. Michelle, a question came in from a student wondering what took Georgetown University so long to make of African American studies from a program into a department.
Thank you for that question. It only, I'm going to answer it kind of, well, it only took 3 years, right? After we were able to hire. I mean, I think that was it. It was an issue of resources for many years, right? And I think once we were able to galvanize the type of support needed in terms of resources, we were able to move very quickly. I also will say that when the program began in 2003, and I do understand that, many programs and departments were founded in the wake of the civil rights movement, right? The late 60s, early 70s. So it looks like we were, not with some of our peer institutions in that work. But at the same time, when we did do so, we were able to do so with many existing resources at that time. And I say that to say that I think that we were doing a lot of the work, but it had not yet been formalized into a plan of study. And so that took time, and it took time to build that up and build with the resources in terms of, faculty primarily. But now we are very, very well situated, and I hope that students will take a look at our offerings in African American Studies, where they can have conversations like the one that we're having now across the many disciplines.
Thank you. A question just came in, and people are wondering about the portrayal of images in religion. One of our students has said that as a child growing up, all she could see were white figures. She saw figures of Jesus Christ, figures of God, what have you, all white images. And so could you comment on that, Father Massengale?
I have an excellent article coming out, an excellent, I think, article coming out in the next issue of U.S. Catholic, the September issue, and I talk about that. In light of research that was done at Stanford University that was just published in January of this year, and it showed an unsurprising correlation that those people who believe that a white man rules the heavens are also more likely to believe that white men should rule on earth. In other words, our images of God, of the holy, and of the sacred have political effects. When I was a kid in the 1960s, I remember once going to church, and as we pulled up in the parking lot, there was this major argument going on because someone had spray painted the statue of Mary that was on the church grounds. They spray painted it black. And there's this furious debate that was going on, and whether some people saw this as a desecration of a sacred image, and other people were saying this was an act of pride given the changing neighborhood, that the neighborhood had changed and now is largely African American. But more to the point was that the people couldn't begin to see God as being anything other than white, or anything, or the sacred as anything other than white. And when we only see God imaged in white, then we also, and Malcolm X said this years ago, we give white people a subtle brainwashing into their superiority. We give people of color a subtle brainwashing into their inferiority. It's a dual brainwashing. Now, as Christians, as believers, we would say that God is beyond race. And so therefore, God can be imaged in all kinds of different ways. The problem is when we make only one image to be normative, and especially when that image is normatively white, then we're reinforcing the social hierarchies of exclusion that we now see in our society. And we also then make it more difficult to preach a message of racial inclusion when subconsciously we're imaged as said, oh no, that only God can only be imaged in this way. Or we can only pray to God using European languages, for example. Or you can't use, you can't have a blues mass or a gospel mass, that's seen as being the exception. God is beyond race, but that means therefore that all races can have the right to image God in a variety of different ways.
Mm-hmm. There are a couple of questions that I think are linked, and I would like to have both of you respond to this particular question. And the question is, what steps or what actions can white people take to become or evolve to being anti-racist?
Well, I think it depends on where you are in your own understanding of race. There's so much good work out there now, right, for us to read and find our language and find where we can start with the work that we need to do in order to create this society, this more just society that we all strive for. But I think a lot of the work has to start in the personal spaces and in your own introspection about the beliefs that you have internalized. It's very difficult, as Father Massengill was just explaining. If this is the way in which you have been oriented to the world, right, that, for example, in religious studies, you have not had opportunity to read, say, James Cohen, right, or to read Howard Thurman, right, then you don't know that there is another way of thinking about the world in terms of your religious training, right? And so I think it is incumbent upon each of us to better understand the world beyond ourselves. Now, here's where I think it becomes a problem, right? With the issue of privilege, right? And it's very difficult when you are situated within privilege to want to move out of that. It is uncomfortable. But at the same time, that's not a place of safety either. And it certainly does not do the work that needs to be done in order for us to have the society that we want. And ultimately, I think we each have to decide whether or not we are willing to do the work to have that society. I think the pandemic has unfortunately caused us to have to think more energetically about this issue of privilege and what it means in terms of our lived experiences and how those experiences are inequitable in ways that bespeak our racialized and racist past.
Mm-hmm. I would echo that in terms of it really does depend upon where you are in your journey of coming to understand that the picture of the world that you are given may not be necessarily a complete picture. One of the things I've found helpful in my teaching is that I teach a course on Christian faith and racial justice. And my white students find the book White Like Me by Tim Wise. It's an earlier book, but basically they read that book and a light bulb goes off because it's a story of someone who is like them, who goes through his journey of realizing, oh, now I get what privilege is, because all too often is that we hear that word and we don't know what it means. And his is a real honest journey of moving from really naivete about what's going on in the world to really understanding, oh, this is what the world really is. This is my place in the world. Now, what do I do about it? And how then do I really become an ally? What does it mean to really be an ally? Because we hear that word a lot. And so I think that reading a book like his, which is really very narrative, very autobiographical, for many students, it's their first entree into like understanding what this discussion is really all about. So I would say that's a great place to start, especially for those who are just, have all these questions about what these terms really mean. I think that's a good entry point for many people.
Okay, good. Thank you. Here's a very detailed question. In the wake of disproportionate radicalized violence enacted within the United States and the violent shutdown of protests that we've witnessed, Seattle, for example, and Washington, D.C., what does it mean to find hope within an anti-Black world that has become so embedded in reality that it is hard to even imagine what a world without racism looks like? Especially thinking about the fact that radical organizations like the Black Panthers, the Combahee River Collective, and many others before them have had the conviction to demand the end of racism, but then their efforts were thwarted by the hand of the state that always seemed to re-emerge to quell that energy. So the question is, how do we balance the process of dedicating our lives to an anti-racist study and not becoming exhausted by the profound violence indoctrinated upon those who speak up?
Mm-hmm. I want that person in my class.
I was going to say, that is an amazingly astute question. That is awesome. Wow. I mean,
fantastic question.
A great question.
Yes.
I've got his name, Dr. Mitchell. I'm going to make sure that I write
Good. Let me try to take a little bit of that. And I appreciate it so much because I do think that racial fatigue is a real thing, right? And I hear in the question despair, but I also hear hope. And I tell you why I say hope. Because for someone to formulate that question that way with that much detail, that person is looking for possibilities. And so I want to make sure we don't lose that. You know, I find very inspiring to think about history, our history. And in those moments, because listen, I understand exactly what your question is gesturing toward, okay? Please know that there are moments where I'm in that space too. But I think back, for example, to Frederick Douglass again here. He's coming up again. And as I was listening, I was thinking about the part about the institutions, right? Power concedes nothing, he said, right? And he was up against institutionalized racism in the form of slavery. But he was up against it. He fought with the tools that he had. And he prevailed. Now, here's where it falls apart, right? If we think that we're ever going to fix this and it'll be fixed forever and ever, amen, not going to happen. That's not going to happen. Now, I hope that is not depressing. I hope it's actually inspiring, because it means that each generation has a role to play in making sure that we are who we want to be, that we are our best selves, that our better angels, right, prevail. And that the work is hard, it is ongoing, it is generational, it is difficult, it is deadly, but the work is for us to do.
Yeah, I want to thank that student for the profundity of that question. I mean, and you can tell it came from a really, really deep place. And I want to also say that, like Dr. Mitchell, I understand where that is, because, as I said in my essay, there have been times this summer that I've been moved to levels of anger and despondency too, that I have not experienced. What gives me hope is I use the image of a relay race. And for me, it's a personal image, because I remember when I was growing up, my grandmother was driving me to the store, and she had one of those old Ramblers that had the long seat in front, this oversized steering wheel, and she didn't believe in using seat belts back then. And this is dating me. So whenever we came to a stop sign, she just put her arm out to hold me back. Now, we all know that that arm wouldn't do any real good if you came into an accident, but it felt comfortable to have your grandmother put her arm around you. And so we came to the stop sign because she put her arm out there, and we stayed stopped for a long period of time. I said, Grandpa, when are we going to go? Like, we're going to go to the store, you're going to buy me something. And she said, we'll go as soon as the people stop going by. I looked out the car window and I saw all these people in a march. And I looked at my grandmother and I said, Grandma, what are they doing? Why are they marching? And she looked at me and she said, they're marching for your rights. They're marching to set us free. And this was in the 1960s. And I now know that I could not do the work that I am doing. I would not be at Fordham University. I would not be speaking to you at Georgetown now if it weren't for what those people did back then. Now, they didn't know there was this 7-year-old kid that was just waiting for them to get out of the way. I couldn't thank them even if I wanted to. But they were part of the relay race. And when you're in a relay race, you're not necessarily going to be the one that's going to cross the finish line. You're not going to break the tape. In a relay race, you're doing your part, running your leg of the race, so that those who come after you can do the work that they need to do. And that's the hope. I'm the fulfillment of their hope, even though they don't even know that I'm doing this now. And I'm doing what I'm doing now because I'm convinced that of these 1.4K participants, someone out there is going to continue the work that I'm going to do. That's where the hope comes in. And that you're not going to be able to do what you need to do if I'm not doing what I need to do. And so I'm running my leg of the race, both to honor those who went before me, but also for the sake of those who come after. And I think that's the hope that he mentioned she mentioned the Black Panthers and how they were brutally repressed, and they were, but the thing is that we're still standing on their shoulders. Mm-hmm. Of those women and men who, yeah, they were repressed, but their work still lives on. I think that's where the hope comes in, is that we're part of this relay race of justice seekers. In the Bible, in Hebrews, it says, now that we're surrounded by this cloud of witnesses, let us press on. And I think that that's what keeps us going. That's where the hope comes in, is that if it's up to me alone, when I get into my poor me mode, then I think, why am I writing this article? Nothing's going to change. And I think that's just realistic. We feel that way, but we're part of a relay race. And that's where the hope comes in.
Mm-hmm. Here's a question for both of you. How can members of other minority groups, such as Asians, Latinx, Native American, Pacific Islanders, etc., support the struggle for racial justice for African Americans, and also simultaneously combat the racism that impacts those communities as well?
I would say that one thing is that it's not a zero-sum game, okay? In other words, it's when I pay attention to anti-Asian bias and violence that's going on in our society right now because of politicians who continue to call this pandemic a Chinese virus or Wuhan virus or whatever, and that has real life effects. When I'm concerned about that, that doesn't mean I can't be concerned about anti-Black violence that people are experiencing from police. In other words, I think what often happens in racial justice work, too often, is that the groups of color are sometimes pitted against each other, and we think that this is a zero-sum game. That if I'm concerned about violence against indigenous or native peoples, that someone's taking attention from my issue. And what happens is that we're then competing for crumbs, rather than trying to have a place where we all are at the table. And that these issues are not a zero-sum issue. Rather, they're part of this ongoing struggle we have in our country to recognize humanity in all of its various forms. All of us are human beings. And when we make progress in helping each other work for the recognition of our equal human dignity and value. So it's not a zero-sum game. It's not like if I'm concerned about immigration, then I'm somehow not concerned about anti-Black violence. No, because one, these categories are not limited ones either. I mean, we know that there are a lot of Black immigrants who are in this country who are struggling with the immigration system. And so I think that we need to see ourselves as involved in a multidimensional process of seeking justice, where we're trying to create a society of equal justice for all. And that means that as a Black person, I am concerned about justice for immigrants and for immigration justice. I'm also deeply concerned about the violence that many of our Asian Americans are experiencing. And that doesn't mean I'm any less committed to having justice for African Americans.
And we have to also remember that oppressions are constitutive, right? And we're here, but we need to internalize and believe this. No one is free until everyone is free.
Amen.
We have to move with that in our spirit and in our hearts. That's a part of the community, right? The beloved community that Dr. King talked about, that we have a fundamental belief in that notion of freedom. I don't know, I agree very much Father Massengale, I think that becomes a point for division, right? And to try to pit the oppressions, or to have some kind of comparative oppression, right? In terms of these institutions that thwart the actualization of people of color.
Mm-hmm.
And we need to stay focused on the fact that those institutions are the source of the division, right? And not what is given to us in terms of our, particularities. Certainly we have our very specific histories, but those histories are informed by each other.
Yes.
Right? And
yes.
we are seeing that again in this moment with the pandemic.
Absolutely.
One of the most wonderful things in my African American Studies classes is when I have students who are students of color that are non-Black, that make those connections with when we're talking about the different liberatory moments in African American experience and history, that they also can see themselves in that moment, and to find the corollaries, right? We look for those in terms of their own personal histories. And so I think that the work that I do in African American Studies allows for that possibility, which is one of the reasons why I think it's one of the most vibrant fields of study.
Here's the question for you, Dr. Mitchell, and it's around the question of theology as a requirement. A student is wondering if there will ever be a point at which race can somehow be embedded in those courses, and can Georgetown ever get to a point where every student will be required to have race or race embedded in courses as an academic requirement to graduate? I know we have the diversity requirement, which is a general requirement, but can you spend some time talking about race and what the prospect would be for us doing this work in the curriculum in the college or SFS or anywhere undergraduate programs?
Excellent question. I love these questions. They're just so thoughtful. I'm going to disjoin them, I think, and take the second part of that question first. I think in terms of, well, here's my idealized answer. For me, inclusive teaching, right, would be where we would have what the student is suggesting, that we would include in our coursework, right, those voices that perhaps are not traditionally included, that to include voices that speak to race and racialized experiences. I do think that our diversity requirement is a step toward that. And I think that perhaps, again, to use Father Massengale's relay race, I think perhaps, students will help us get to the next stage, because here's the truth of that. Students helped us get to that stage, to have a diversity requirement. Students have so much power, right, in terms of helping us to see the future. And when we listen and take seriously what they say, change happens, and change that benefits us all. In terms of the specifics of theology, we do have courses that engage, right, the issue of race, I think, as the question posed it. And then also we have the African American Studies courses that also, because they are interdisciplinary, allow for that type of interrogation as well. So I would just ask that student to be in touch, and maybe we can find some courses that might move toward that space that he or she is looking, and perhaps we can talk about what we could do in the future as well.
And to give you some encouragement, because I know Jesuit institutions like to compete against each other, tell the Georgetown Religious Studies faculty that It's impossible for a student to take a theology or introductory theology class at Fordham and not engage race.
Like that.
In other words, built
That's right.
into our faith and critical reason, the course that everyone has to take, everyone has to engage race, everyone has to read non-Christian, non-white authors in that course. So we have a diversity requirement at Fordham too, but one of the things we're working on, we don't want students to only engage race in that one course that they take in the 4 years. I mean, that's a step in the right direction, but that's a real baby step, frankly. And to say that, yeah, it is not only possible, but I think it's imperative if you're going to be taking theology classes that you need to engage race. Like I teach a course on homosexuality and Christian ethics. Even a course on homosexuality, we deal with race. So we talk about the racialized experiences because not every cultural group experiences sexual difference in the same way. So in other words, I don't know how if we're going to really be incarnational people, and that's what we say we are as Catholic Christians, then we have to take the human condition seriously. Our human condition is racialized and it needs to be in theology. So I know Georgetown wants to think itself as being the premier Jesuit institution, but just let you know at Fordham, we got one up on you. So if I put that challenge out there, I'm sure that next time we have this conversation, it will be very different. I'm sure it will be.
I certainly love that approach, Reverend Massengale. I think that makes a lot of sense. And I would take that a step further. If we can identify every class that students are required to take to graduate from Georgetown University, I would hazard a guess that almost all of those classes lend themselves very well to integrating and incorporating themes of race within those classes in terms of substantive discussions, in terms of textbook, in terms of readings and research. So we just have to think outside the box and not just think that the only place where you can engage in a course is a diversity requirement course or a sociology course, but there are many classes in which we can really incorporate and integrate issues of race within those courses.
And to make a point here, I think oftentimes when we have this conversation, some faculty colleagues look and say we're trying to institute political correctness into the curriculum. And I want to challenge that notion because a university is founded upon the pursuit of truth. That's what President DeGioia said. How can we say that we're responsible for the pursuit of truth if we're going to exclude the truths that are found from the majority of the human family? If we're saying that the truths that are found in the African experience and the Asian experience and the Native experience and the Latino experience, if we're saying that those truths we're not responsible for the pursuit of truth if we're not looking at the truth that's found in the entire human community. So this is not a plea for political correctness. It's a plea for us to be faithful to our mission in the pursuit of truth.
Here's another intriguing question that either of you can, or both of you can respond to. What is being done to unlearn socialized racist behaviors and beliefs? What is being done or what can be done for people to unlearn those behaviors? I mean, we get these messages in the media, we get these messages in ads for cosmetics, we get these images in the movies, we see the situation comedy called Friends, and everyone in Friends, they're all white people. I mean, there's so many messages coming at us from so many different directions. What do we do to really combat those messages? Because they're very powerful and have long-lasting effects upon the psyche of human beings.
I think one thing to realize is that the work is always ongoing. Because even as an African-American man, I'm still unlearning the internalized messages that I received from watching media and cartoons and growing up and things like that. But the other thing is that there's an approach in theology called liberation theology. And it begins by saying that we begin to unlearn when we have new experiences in life that don't match our old frame, that we can't interpret with the knowledge we've received. Oftentimes students will say when they come to college, when they come to Georgetown, they come to Fordham, they come to Marquette, and they say, this is the most diverse community I've ever lived in. Now, I look at that and say, where did you grow up? Because this is not diverse, but if this is the most diverse community you've ever lived in, how is this community, how is the experiences, how are they challenging what you've learned? Because when we begin to have a friction where we have an experience of life that doesn't match or conform or confirm everything we've known before, that's when we have the space for unlearning. I think we begin to unlearn when our old frameworks are challenged and stretched by new experiences. And that's why I think it's so important while use these college years to go outside your comfort zone, to make yourself uncomfortable, to seek out discomfort, because it's in that lack of comfort that there is now the space that's open for something new to begin to germinate within your own consciousness.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think that is one of the benefits of the college/university experience, that you do have the opportunity to push yourself beyond your comfort zone, and safely, right? I mean, because that can be very discomforting, but the unexamined life is not worth living, right? And so therefore that's a part of it. And I think Georgetown and Washington especially provides so many opportunities for that. For example, students can take courses at Howard University.
Right.
That is an option, right? It's a part of the consortium. That's one way. Also engaging with the community. We have so many programs, outreach programs and other, that you can be a part of in order to move beyond the gates. I in my classes, I do things to try to, enable that. For example, in one class, I had students to take the metro, but to take a particular line, say the orange line, from one end to the other end, and then write about what they see, what they observe, especially in terms of race. And if you know anything about that, the orange line, you know that it ends over in Virginia in the suburbs, and the other end of the line is over in Prince George's County, which is a predominantly Black county.
Right.
And so you can see there, right? Or to work into courses, visits in Washington, for example, Frederick Douglass's home, and having to navigate to move beyond Georgetown to go to it. Once I had a student say that she was so comfortable, traveling around Europe using the metro, and she had never been on the metro in DC. Mm-hmm. So you see, you have to take ownership of the opportunities in order to grow into the person that you want to be, into these experiences that will help you do your life's work. You may not have all the answers at this moment, but these things all shape you into being, right, the person that you want to be after you leave Georgetown. And it's so incredibly important to take those opportunities. Even a course that you think might be a bit uncomfortable. Let's see why you feel that way.
That's great. One of the optional supplemental readings that students had for this session was to read an essay critiquing the book White Fragility. And the author of the critique was Professor John McWhorter. And McWhorter argues that the book patronizes and infantilizes Black people. And the student is wondering if you have any thoughts or perspectives on white fragility, number one. And then secondly, if you're familiar with McWhorter's interpretation of that book, what is your perspective of McWhorter's interpretation?
I'll start with that one because I think white fragility is a very important work. And I am familiar with John McWhorter's critique of it. I would begin with saying this. My critique of of Dr. DeAngelo's book is this. I'm not sure I am comfortable with this term white fragility, because for me, it seems to, I don't like the framing of that. In other words, that for you to be racially aware and conscious, right, for you to understand white privilege, that you have to confront the fragility of that experience, it just seems to me to be misdirection in terms of what is really at stake. But I do get the utility of it. I also am curious as to how her subject position as a white woman operates within that space, right? Because there are things that she is able to say to particular audiences that will be received in particular ways that if I, for example, said would be received, but perhaps in a different way. So I think there's so many moving parts with that work. I appreciate that the work tries to move white audiences especially into a space of consciousness. I'm not sure if that space of consciousness is as fulsome as it needs to be. I think McWhorter is getting at that, but I also think McWhorter is doing some other work, right? That he is taking issue with the fact that as a white woman, she is making particular and specific pronouncements about Black interaction with white folk. So I think there's a lot going on between McWhorter and DeAngelo that may not be as helpful as we would like. But I think DeAngelo's work can be useful in opening us some space, but we need to move beyond it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would basically agree. It gives me a chance to, I saw a comment came up, people wanted to repeat the name of the book I said, and it's White Like Me by Tim Wise, W-I-S-E, so White Like Me, which I think is frankly a better work than DeAngelo's work. I mean, I find it more helpful. The concept of white fragility, I think it's doing some important work, but I also am worried that too many people think it's the end all and the be all in the racial discussion. And that's my concern with it. I think she's naming an important dynamic that often happens in white Americans when they're put in racially uncomfortable conversations or situations.
Mm-hmm.
That leads them then to act defensively, to be argumentative, to be minimizing. And I do think that there is a tendency, therefore, for us in interracial dialogues to want to tailor them so that white people don't become uncomfortable. And so I do think she's naming that dynamic. I mean, I get that whenever I talk about these issues, sooner or later someone's asking me the question, how can I talk about this on my campus or in my classroom and not make white people uncomfortable? And I say, let's think about that question. Why is it that the only group that's never supposed to be uncomfortable in racialized situations are white people? Besides discomfort, discounting the real discomfort, even fear and terror of people of color in those situations, if we make white comfort the litmus test for our racial conversations and activism, then there are important truths that will never be said and places we will never go. And so I think DeAngelo's work is helpful in interrogating that dynamic. My fear is that it can, in a very paradoxical way, reinscribe that dynamic so that, okay, now we know about white fragility, so now we have to be extra careful in these conversations so we don't provoke these reactions, which I don't think she wants to do, but I've seen people use that concept in that way or misuse that concept in that way.
Mm-hmm. I really like the way Andy has framed the whole question of anti-racism. And I think that work, I find that work very helpful in making it possible for people of any race to really get a much better understanding about how this whole system of white supremacy, how all of that works. And I'm still trying to wrap my head around the major premise of D'Angelo's work. But I think ultimately, I think Andy, I mean, that's the work that I think really hits the nail on the head for me in terms of how to approach the dialogue and how to engage people in this discussion. Because as you said, the defensiveness is palpable when people are put in a situation, especially white people, where there's this feeling of discomfort. And I think when that happens, then in a way, it I think masks the real issue of how we can combat the problem that we're trying to solve.
And that's why I said in my essay, there's a difference between feeling uncomfortable and feeling threatened.
Right.
And I think all too often people interpret one for the other. And I think that we need to, in a sense, it's only when we give ourselves permission to be in that uncomfortable place that then there can be a possibility for growth. There can be a possibility for conversion. There can be a possibility for something new to emerge, but it won't happen as long as we stay safe, settled. And I think that we need to allow ourselves the permission, give ourselves permission to be uncomfortable and let things, in a sense, be messy. You know, growing up in Wisconsin, there were plenty of farms around. And you know, you don't get new crops unless you have a mess, unless the earth needs to be muddy. And I see my job when I teach in a classroom, and I think Dr. Mitchell said this earlier, you need to create that safe place that allows people the safety to be uncomfortable, the safety to be in that muddy place, to let them be uncomfortable, let them know that you're not being threatened while you're being uncomfortable. And I think that's the responsibility I have as an educator then. And when I do that, then I create the possibilities for new growth to happen and for a new racial consciousness to happen.
Absolutely. Unfortunately, we're coming to the end of our time together.
I know we've gone way over time.
We really have gone over.
And the students that hung in there with us, you got something good going on with the class of 2024.
It certainly is. And I certainly want to commend the students for asking such thoughtful and provocative questions.
Absolutely.
I mean, if this class is representative of who the leaders are going to be in our world going forward, I'm very inspired and I'm very encouraged by what we have and based upon what you have asked. I also want to take this opportunity to thank Dr. Mitchell and Father Massengale for your wonderful words of wisdom, for responding to the questions in such a thoughtful manner, and to the new student orientation group. Thank you for organizing this panel. I think we could easily have had it for 2 hours. And what I would like to propose to the new student orientation group is to see whether we can develop some way of continuing this discussion during those classes